There is fresh optimism in the Middle East that a ceasefire in Gaza is closer than ever. CIA Director William Burns arrived in Qatar Wednesday as negotiators push for a breakthrough to end the 14-month conflict. But even with talks underway, the fighting continues. Palestinian health officials say multiple Israeli airstrikes killed at least 20 people across Gaza Wednesday. CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay reports from Tel Aviv.
Well, for the first time in a long time, there is renewed optimism that a deal could finally be reached for a ceasefire in Gaza in exchange for the release of hostages. John Kirby, the White House spokesman, says they are cautiously optimistic in Washington that a deal could be reached. Also, a Hamas source tells the Washington Post that Hamas is giving up its demand for the IDF, that's the Israeli military, to end the war first and to completely pull out of the Strip. And in Israel, the defense minister said that this is the closest they've been since the last deal more than a year ago, which led to the release of more than 100 hostages. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is under a lot of pressures, namely from incoming President Donald Trump, who has said repeatedly that there will be, quote, hell to pay if the hostages aren't released before he comes into office. There are 80% of Israelis here in the country who say that they are also in favor of some kind of a deal to end the war in exchange for those hostages. So the domestic pressures in Israel are also quite intense. And now also, for the first time in a long time, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has enough support within his coalition to survive members of that coalition leaving in protest over a ceasefire deal. That's been the threat for many, many months, that some of these more hardline members of his coalition who were against a deal to end the war would walk out, and that could topple his government. But now Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has the support to survive that kind of a thing. And so for the first time, we're seeing more and more hope that a deal could come through. That said, we also spoke to family members of the hostages. We spoke to the father of two of those hostages who have been held for more than a year now. We asked him if he's optimistic, and he told us he's had his heart broken so many times in the past that he won't believe it until he sees it with his own eyes, until he sees his two boys walking across the border with Gaza and into Israel. Back to you.
Chris Livesay, thank you. Jon Alterman joins us now. He's a senior vice president and director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So, John, it's been more than 6 months since President Biden announced that ceasefire framework in late May. That proposal never came to fruition. What is different this time?
It feels like the Hamas position has moved significantly. Certainly, there's a different Hamas leadership because the previous Hamas leadership was killed. I think the Israelis are a little more interested than they had been. And so there seems to be some signs of optimism. The interesting thing is right now, there's more optimism coming from the Hamas side, and the Israeli side is pouring a little bit of cold water on it. But we're seeing steps that look like serious efforts to figure out how many hostages are alive, who's actually holding them, what would lists look like of people being exchanged. This is the prelude to possibly getting an actual deal.
The New York Times reports Hamas may be willing to let Israel maintain a military presence in Gaza. How big of a concession would that be for Hamas, and why might the group be taking this new stance?
Well, we'll see exactly what it means. What I understood is there's some willingness for a temporary military presence. How that's phrased, what's understood by it. I mean, there might be a little bit of wiggle room, but certainly there has been polling coming out of Gaza since September suggesting that Gazans are just exhausted. They just want an end to the violence. There may be a public opinion reason why Hamas has softened its position, in addition to the fact that, as I said, the hardline leadership, Yahya Sinwar in particular, is now dead.
If the Biden administration can move this across the finish line, what would that mean for the president's legacy, and what role would the incoming Trump administration play in trying to maintain the ceasefire?
You know, in some ways, I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration would take credit. As your package suggested, President Trump and President-elect Trump said that if the hostages are still there when he takes office, there will be hell to pay. So he can take credit, and certainly his envoys have been in the region trying to move things forward, in addition to President Biden's envoys, I think from President Biden's perspective, he would say, this is what I've been trying to do all along. We were finally successful. And President Trump and his team would say, what made it work was the fact that President Trump was coming into office and people said, we have to make this deal.
Jon Alterman, thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Always good to see you.
Thanks.